unfortunately 2 small Quaker meetings in DC when he was elected president, and they decided to consolidate once he came into town. So story has it is that like during meeting for worship, his bodyguards would stand in these like windowed rooms here. But yeah, typical Quaker architecture is that it's often around like arranged in a kind of a circular format like this because we don't have ministers or pastors, and we sit in silence for an hour waiting for the Spirit to move. And in that case, someone will stand up and share a message. So that's a little intro to Quakerism there. But Quakers are very into simplicity, so there's not a lot of ornamentation to the room, no crosses, just as simple as possible. But we're really grateful for Prince William Washington to host us tonight, and hopefully we actually had our first ecumenical economics event here. Was anyone here for that trip? Yes. That was on Abundance last summer, where we invited some folks to have a conversation about the abundance agenda and what its shortcomings were and its assets. So, yeah. I think we can go ahead and get started. Someone can grab the mic. Are we going?
Well, yeah, and the audio works.
Okay, cool. Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for coming here tonight. This is an event of ecumenical economics. This is a nonpartisan forum where we discuss heterodox economics, which is basically economics outside of the mainstream neoclassical, neoliberal frame. And this started as this, we had very humble beginnings. I founded this with my colleague Mike Hawk, who is downstairs taking RSVPs, and we were both congressional staffers and both struck by I guess you could say the lack of diversity of economic ideas coming into the legislative branch, and we saw this as an opportunity to bring in people on the outside with really good ideas, really good perspectives, and so we started this reading group, and now we have incorporated a 501c3 where we host events like these with great experts and organizers like these, and we talk about the things that you wouldn't get in Econ 101. And we talk about the ways that mainstream economics has failed us over the last 50 years, really, particularly after 2008, the financial crisis, the ways it failed us during COVID, the ways that this neoliberal style of economic reasoning that we've been governed under over the last few decades, how it has failed to meet our basic needs, making housing, healthcare, all our basic stuff way more expensive than usual. A bit of background on me, my name is Kelly Crouch. I'm very excited about having this conversation about Catholic social teaching. I first learned about Catholic social teaching when I went to seminary. I'm kind of an odd bird where I did religious education at seminary before I came to Capitol Hill, but I was so struck by the insights and the critiques that Catholic social teaching had about the economy and capitalism. And it turns out like an institution that precedes capitalist markets has really good things to say about it, compared to Protestants, where we kind of like grew up alongside capitalism, so we're kind of a creature of it in ways that Catholicism has not been. So after I graduated from seminary, I went to the London School of Economics, where they did teach me how to think like a neoclassical economist, where you reduce everything to cost-benefit analysis and quantification. And coming into that space from my seminary background, where I was taught to kind of interrogate what these moral assumptions were underneath of these social sciences, because the social sciences are built on these assumptions about what it means to be human, like what our relationship is with the earth, what we owe each other. And neoclassical economics, it presents itself as a science, but sometimes we don't have the conversation about these long-held assumptions that we've been carrying the discipline over for a long time. So that's why I think tonight we're going to talk about like what religion has to say about this, and I think it's a conversation that we don't have a whole lot, and yeah, so really excited to get into it tonight. I will go ahead and introduce our panelists here. Starting on the far edge here, Anthony Annett. He is an economist and author of a book called Cathonomics: How the Catholic Tradition Can Create a More Just Economy. He's a PhD from Columbia. He spent 2 decades at the International Monetary Fund as a speechwriter, and then he is currently working on a book at the intersection of democracy and economic justice. And you should check out his podcast, The Moral Revolution, just launched a couple months ago. And here we have Elizabeth Garlow, who I'm so impressed with your ability to move in like lots of different spaces.
Another ad for each other.
Yeah, Elizabeth like spends her time with like finance people, Catholic nuns, she like government bureaucrats. She easily moves in all these spaces and is able to find connections between them. So she works at the intersection of faith, finance, and economics. She's a fellow at New America, where she writes and convenes on the spiritual dimensions of economic systems change. She co-founded the Francesco Collaborative, currently launching a very cool project called Charism Capital, which is a global impact first fund with Catholic sisters. And then she's done lots of other cool stuff, working at the Vatican, the Lumina Foundation, the Obama administration, and you have also spent some time in intentional communities in Latin America and Europe. So I really like having you all here too, because you're not just wongs, but you are very in the weeds and practical with how you apply your faith and approach to economics. So, quick run of show. The purpose of tonight is to learn about how religion has shaped and critiqued the economic world we're living in right now, and how it can be a powerful tool for helping us dream bigger. Even if you're not a person of faith, or if you're not religious, I hope you can come away with this with some ideas on how you can use some of these concepts to dream bigger than you already are about what is possible. This is currently being live streamed, but for the Q&A afterwards, we will cut the feed so we can have a candid conversation with just us in the room. But to those joining us online, really happy to have you with us. So without further ado, we will get into this is all about Catholic social teaching. So I'm gonna pass it to Tony first. Can you give us an idea of what this is, Catholic social teaching?
Sure, okay. Thanks to Kelly and Ecumenical Economics and to the wonderful Quaker community here in DuPont Circle. It's a great pleasure to be here. Catholic social teaching dates back to 1891, when you had a pope called Leo XIII, who, in many respects was a kind of a conservative figure from his time. But he noticed that the Industrial Revolution was throwing up these incredible injustices. Workers were faced with long hours, low wages, dangerous conditions, no power, no unions, nothing. And he thought that, Christianity has a lot to say about economic justice. So Catholic social teaching really begins there, and it says, how can we take the timeless principles of Christianity that date back 2,000 years and apply them to these very new circumstances of industrial capitalism? And started in 1891, and it's gone all the way up to Pope Leo XIV, the current Pope today. Most popes since then have written on economic and social issues. They have developed a tradition because, you know, as times change, emphasis change. After the Second World War, with decolonization, there was a much more emphasis on global development issues and inequality between rich and poor countries. With Pope Francis, then the emphasis became on the environmental crisis because, you know, in 1891, people hadn't really figured that out yet, but now they have. So this is the beauty of Catholic social teaching is it's flexible. You have principles that don't change, but you apply it to conditions that do change. And I think, you know, if you want to sum it up in one term, it would be the common good. The idea that we are not isolated individuals maximizing our own well-being, as Adam Smith says. No, we are members of a community, and we are all responsible for one another. And our flourishing depends on the flourishing of everybody else, and nobody can be excluded. So that's the core principle of Catholic social teaching, the idea of the common good. I'll mention one more thing. Principle called the universal destination of goods that was drawn out actually by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, that says the goods of the earth belong to all people, not just the rich, not just those with property rights, everybody. How does that? And obviously, in a medieval world, that had certain implications. In a world of industrial capitalism, it has very profound implications for how government can tax and redistribute and create economic justice in society. So this is, it's also, I'll stop there because we could go on forever with this, but this is kind of what Catholic social teaching is all about.
That's a great summary, thank you, Tony. To bring it concretely into what Catholic social teaching has given us, Elizabeth, I wanted you to maybe talk a little bit about what kinds of things do we have today that are products of Catholic social teaching, particularly institutions in the alternative finance space. And then also, I was hoping you could also talk a little bit about your work that you're doing right now with Catholic Sisters.
Yeah. So I think Tony spoke very beautifully into the origins of Catholic social thought as offering a structural critique of the economic system, and I think that has persisted over time. And we have, in Catholic social thought, we have this sort of reminder that markets themselves are not neutral, that markets are embedded with certain moral assumptions. And so over time, Catholic social teaching has been able to look at our economic structures, in particular market-based structures, and offer a critique about who really benefits from those systems, how power and wealth is distributed, to whom does benefit accrue, to whom do risks accrue. And so a good example of this is the birth of the credit union movement in 1908 in Manchester, New Hampshire. A priest started the first credit union called St. Mary's Bank, I believe it was called St. Mary's, and it was essentially to offer access to financial services for French-Canadian textile workers. And I think this also is drawing from Catholic social teaching's profound emphasis on the right to association, which emerges from this idea that we are relational, that we have an understanding of human nature as inherently relational, as communal. What was the quote you were sharing with me earlier today about this Catholic theologian about infinite?
Infinite relationality. Christianity is the religion of infinite relationality.
And who is that?
John Zizioulas, a theologian of the Orthodox Church.
I just thought that was a beautiful quote. And so the credit union movement really dates back, over 100 years. And then, I think we have other really notable examples. Many folks who are interested in the cooperative movement know know Father Jose Maria Arizmendi, who started the Mondragon Cooperative in Spain, in the Basque region of Spain, that he was heavily influenced by Catholic social thought. And it was those principles that gave rise to this network of worker-owned cooperatives across many different industries. And I think the cooperative movement has deep roots in these principles of Catholic social teaching broadly. There's more to say about that. But fast forward to some of the work that's ongoing today. We live in an economic system where wealth is increasingly concentrated. There are a handful of asset managers that own the vast majority of wealth and in turn can influence our political processes in ways that are deeply, deeply problematic. And so if you want to, again, take this approach of critiquing the underlying structures of our economic system, it's not sufficient to tinker around the edges of it. You have to question the fundamental sort of ownership structure underlying all this. Who owns wealth? Who owns the capital? And so the work I'm doing now that Kelly mentioned with Catholic Sisters looks at the ways that in the early 70s, they began investing in community banks in the south side of Chicago. So for those of you who know the community development finance industry movement, CDFIs, that movement has its origins in Catholic Sisters saying, okay, we've started schools, we've started hospitals, we have some retirement savings, but how are we going to keep ministering to these communities that are redlined? Like, we can't live in integrity with ourselves if our savings are essentially contributing to an exclusionary financial system where these communities we are ministering to are being redlined. So they started investing. One of the earliest CDFIs was Shore Bank, and they kicked off that movement, you guys. So it's really profound. It's a story that I don't think is super well known, but as these sisters are now aging, we are asking this question of how do we not only preserve that legacy, but invite others into it by really shifting the culture of finance away from one that just centers profit maximization to one that takes into account many other different considerations about the purpose of finance, right, and its role, and to invest our resources in ways that more deeply express those values.
And I think the conversation about CDFIs is really interesting right now because they've been under attack over the past year. And so what do you think the financial system would look like without a lot of these things like credit unions or CDFIs?
Well, I think those kinds of institutions have helped us to democratize finance, over the years, right? I mean, it's enabled us to improve people's access to finance, but it's also grounded in a principle of enoughness, right? So we live in a culture, and I think this is also a cultural consequence of neoliberal economics, which is an ethic of maximization sort of governs our lives, right? Trying to maximize for wealth accumulation. And I understand it's complex because we also live in a society where there is no reliable safety net for many people, right? And so it feeds a culture of scarcity. It feeds that culture of fear. But I think what these credit union movements, cooperative economic movements have said is, it's about more than just any one person. It's about our infinite relationality. It's about the common good. It's about community, and that we can't thrive without that. We simply cannot thrive without that. And so it's a reminder, it's that clarion call to come back to what is essential for our flourishing, and that my flourishing is bound up in the flourishing of everyone else's. And so that's another call of Catholic social thought, is to recognize our deep interconnectedness.
Tony, I was also hoping that you could talk about, since neoclassical economics, as I said, is making a lot of assumptions about what it means to be human, which brings it to a lot of different conclusions than Catholic social thought arrives at. So I was hoping you could give us an understanding of how Catholic social teaching conceives of what it means to be human.
Right, yeah, okay. Well, the starting point is human dignity, the absolute and unviolable human dignity of every single person in the world. That's the foundation. And from that, you get the idea of integral human development, which is the full flourishing of the whole person. Not just, as Elizabeth said, not just wealth, but who you are as a person in all your dimensions of life. That neoclassical economics has no conception of that. Neoclassical economics thinks that you are single-mindedly focused on maximizing your utility, which is just an economist way of saying stuff you can buy in the market. And the only limit to your desires is the money you have. So you want as much money as possible to get as much stuff as possible, and you are on your own. It's you're individually maximizing the satisfaction of your subjective preferences. That's neoclassical economics in a nutshell. Catholic social teaching is completely the opposite of that. It's beings in relation. We are defined in relation to other people. What matters is our integral human development, the development of the whole person and every person. And, the guiding principle is less self-interest than solidarity, which is very simply the idea that we are all responsible for all. We're all in this together. So, if you're suffering, I'm suffering. That's the way it works. We're all human beings. So very profound differences, I would say, between the two systems.
So this is also making me think with your comment about infinite relationality. Well, maybe you could talk a little bit more about that. Is this kind of referencing this question that Jesus asked of who is my neighbor?
Exactly. Yeah.
Which also gets misconstrued, I think.
Yes, so I heard Metropolitan John Zizioulas, who unfortunately died during the COVID pandemic. He was very old, he was in his 90s. He was a brilliant theologian, very close to the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople. And Zizioulas' theology is all about that we as human beings are defined not by our individuality, but our relationality. Who we are depends on our relationships. And then he reflected, as you said, on the parable of the Good Samaritan when Jesus asked, who is my neighbor? The answer to that question, and Pope Francis, by the way, said the same thing, is everybody in the world. Now, people like J.D. Vance will come out and say, oh no, we have circles. My family's more important, and then my community, and then maybe my nation, and then maybe if I have anything left over, other people in the world. That's not Christianity. Christianity is infinite relationality. Every single person in the world is your neighbor. I think that's crucial.
So in terms of taking care of everyone from a public policy level, what kinds of impacts did this have on the conception of the role of the state in building the welfare state post-World War II? How did Catholic social teaching influence all that?
Yes, so this is a fascinating piece of history which is actually kind of forgotten today. But Catholic social teaching is not just a bunch of stale papal encyclicals that very few people read. It was actually put into practice after the Second World War in Europe by the Christian democratic parties in Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Austria. They're all run by Christian democratic countries. Basically, they said, well, what would an economy look like based on these Catholic social teaching principles? And they said, well, obviously, you would want a strong welfare state because you want to know that people are protected from unemployment or disability or old age or poverty. You want to make sure that unions are strong so that workers have the power and the agency to bargain against employers for a fair share of economic progress. That's also central to Catholic social teaching. They introduced co-determination, which is where workers sit on boards of directors and on work councils to co-manage enterprises with their bosses. That's a very German idea. Also very central to Catholic social teaching. Economic plan. The French said, well, we'll do economic planning. And that was the way they thought of it. The Italians thought that we would have a large state-owned sector. We would manage the common good that way. So there were different ways of doing it. So they were all kind of grappling with how do you apply these principles, and sometimes they came up with different solutions, but they were all morally serious people who, you know, took this seriously, especially after the Second World War and the Holocaust and everything that did to Europe. They really said, how do we rebuild our societies? How do we rebuild it? We obviously want to start with liberal democracy. But what else? We also want what the Germans call the social market economy, which is the idea that, okay, we have a market economy. We don't have the Soviet Union. But we want to make sure that that market economy is benefiting everybody. And you do that through the means I've already mentioned, the welfare state, unions, co-determination, all these different ways. So this was put into practice. And by the way, the welfare states in Christian democratic countries were bigger than in Scandinavian and Nordic countries. That's counterintuitive to people, but it's even true today. The welfare state is bigger in Germany, Italy, and France than it is in Norway, Sweden, or Denmark. That's the Christian democratic legacy.
Tony, I was also hoping that you could explain for the audience, like, what is the difference between Christian democracy, social democracy, and then maybe while you're at it, you could throw in how the Catholic Church has thought about communism in terms of Catholic social teaching.
Okay. There's a lot there. Okay. Well, so Christian democracy, the difference between Christian democracy and social democracy is quite nuanced. Christian democracy, you know, the less positive side of it is it was very paternalistic. It taught that, you know, workers were men, women were at home. That was the way they thought of it in the 1940s and 1950s. So you want to do your best to make sure to support that male sole breadwinner. Scandinavian social democracy was more egalitarian. Women worked in much higher proportions in Scandinavia than in continental Europe. And also the welfare states were different. Scandinavia was much more based on, we tax everybody at quite high rates, but we give everybody benefits. We give you all free healthcare, education, childcare, maternity and paternity leave, elder care. Everybody is protected from cradle to grave. Christian democratic welfare states were quite different. They were really based on income replacement. If you lose your job, we give you money. If you retire, we give you money. If you're disabled, we give you money. Quite a different system, which explains, by the way, why it turns out to be more expensive in Christian democracies, because you're giving people a lot of money. But it's a kind of a different philosophy. Social democracy, the Scandinavian model, which, by the way, I think is an incredibly successful model even today, was really based on the idea that you have rights of citizenship to all these economic goods and services. Christian democracy is much more about protecting people from the vagaries of the market economy. Communism. Okay, communism. The Catholic Church from the very beginning has been against communism, and in fact one reason why Catholic social teaching developed, remember I mentioned Pope Leo XIII, 1891, he was really worried that Catholic workers were being enticed by socialists. This made him very nervous. So he basically said, we need to offer something to these workers. We need to make sure they have just wages. We need to make sure they have unions. We need to make sure they're protected. We want to kind of take this sting out of the communist tail. So, you know, the opposition to communism in Catholic social teaching is kind of multi-layered. The main idea is that Catholic social teaching does believe in the right to private property, even though it's always subject to a social mortgage, as Pope John Paul II put it, the universal destination of goods. So the right to private property is a right, but it's a secondary right, not a primary right. But it is against the idea that you deny any private ownership of the means of production, as you would have, say, in a communist country. It also has an issue with treating people as just cogs in the machine, as you are socio-economic units. Remember, Catholic social teaching is based on integral human development. You are a full, flourishing, thriving person. In your personhood is expressed not just through your class relationships, it's expressed through your psychology, your emotions, your artistic endeavors, your culture, your religion, all these different dimensions. So it doesn't like the fact that communism reduced you to a very pure socio-economic dimension. And the final thing is, very simply, communism was atheist. The church didn't like that. So there was that too.
Thanks, Tony. So I think it's fair to say, based on this beautiful historical analysis that we've done on the contributions that Catholic social teaching has given to us, I'm wondering, so it doesn't really seem to fit it doesn't fit very squarely into political ideologies or political parties. I guess in Europe it actually did turn into political parties, but here in the US, with the left and the right, do you see, and kind of pivoting to like where we are in this moment now and looking to the future, do you see, like Elizabeth, any opportunities for using these kinds of ideas or religious frameworks for creating coalitions that you otherwise wouldn't be able to create, basically?
Yeah, maybe even just taking a step back, I think we've ended up in a situation since the Reagan era, we were talking about this earlier, where religion was co-opted by the conservative agenda in ways that I think have been really sad and problematic for the vibrancy of our political life, because I think religious traditions have been at the forefront of most social movements because they invite what we might call a moral imagination or a prophetic imagination into the picture. Because if you think about it, religious traditions, spaces, communities, they ground you in a social moral order, which allows you to interrogate the underlying assumptions of the status quo in a way that might otherwise be hard to see, right, when you're caught up in a particular paradigm. And because you're able to do that, you're also able to cast forward a vision that is aspirational. And building coalitions requires aspiration, because coming together outside of any one particular agenda, be that a party agenda or an individual agenda or a group agenda, is an aspirational undertaking that I think we have to be invited to transcend our own preferences. And I think religious traditions have practiced doing that and inviting us to transcend those individual preferences. And so I'm quite interested in how we can shift our vocabulary broadly in our culture around the role of spiritual and moral practice in this work. I think we've sort of, especially over the last 50 years in the US, we've allowed a lot of technocratic solutioning to crowd out religious, spiritual, and moral conversation. And I think it's time to call it back in. It doesn't belong to any one party, person, or group. It belongs to all of us. And so I don't know if that's getting to your question around coalitions, what you had in mind, but that's when I think of the role of faith and religion in this work of building coalitions to shift systems and shift paradigms. That's what comes to mind.
So how do you think we got to this situation where it seems like the only time we hear about faith and politics together, it is through Christian nationalism or other forms of nationalism? Because you mentioned that a lot of social movements in this country and many other countries that have given us really good things were led by religious communities that kind of created these visions for what we could have. Like how how did we lose that?
Wow, when I think of the civil rights movement, right? I think about just so how did we lose it? It's a very, very complex question and multi-layered, and I'm no expert in this. However, in my own personal and professional experience, I mean, even my own career over the last 20 years, I have been in many spaces where religious discussion was not allowed. It was not invited, it was not welcome. I think many, especially left or center-left institutions in this country, wanted to, keep religion at arm's length. And I think in many ways, it actually, faith communities maybe became instrumentalized. Like, faith communities could be used or worked with towards certain ends, towards certain purposes, but not in the invitation of imagination and of deeper interrogation of the system, of the assumptions that are guiding our decisions. So, and then what I said about, I think this kind of emphasis on technocratic solutioning, one thing I appreciated about Pope Francis when he talked about he wrote about the ecological crisis. I don't know if anyone here had the chance to read his letter called Laudato Si, and there was a film made about it. And he really, I think, named so beautifully there the problem of this technocratic paradigm, this idea that we are going to sort of, constantly solution our way out of our current crisis through better technocratic solutions without grappling with these deeper questions of who we are as human beings and how we are to live on this planet. And those deeper invitations are conversions of the heart. They're not just conversions of the head. They're not, yes, human genius has a role to play in all this, right? But that genius is multifaceted. And so I think this over-reliance on technocratic solutions at the expense of these deeper kinds of conversations. But at the same time, I think I'm really starting to see a big shift in this. I do think more and more groups are saying, I think we need to have communities of faith around the table, also because many of these, like the sisters I work with, they have centuries of practice, literally centuries of practice, figuring out how you can common your resources, and how you can work through conflict, and how you can build rhythms of life that are healthy for the person, right? Where you combine work, rest, and care, and mutual care. So there's some real wisdom there.
So I'm going to ask you a question. Maybe we can go to Tony after that too. But so for folks in the audience who are working in policy, but maybe are not religious, who are not really exposed to like religious communities, but they don't want to instrumentalize, like you said. How do you have advice for them on how they can incorporate these ideas into their work or work with these communities? Like, what do you see happening that seems to be working well?
So, I take a lot of my lessons from the Catholic sisters that I work with because they have been staunch social justice advocates for many, many decades in this country. And I always see them really taking a posture of deep listening in the communities that they're working with. And again, to bring it back to Catholic social teaching, there are some really rich nuggets in Catholic social thought about how decision making should be as decentralized as possible. There's this principle of it's called subsidiarity, right? And it's this idea that decision making should be done at the lowest level possible, the highest level necessary, essentially. And what it has invited, I think, in some spaces that I've been a part of, is this trust in the lived expertise of the people around the table, right? And also who they are as whole human beings, not just one particular contribution that they can make. And so I think one thing is recognizing the ways that spiritual, moral, and faith traditions have formed some of us in certain ways that we show up in our work and in the world, and how do we make space for that? And that, for me, that's just begun in my own life, having to look at, what are the deeper motivations for why I'm doing what I'm doing, and what are the practices that might sustain me in that, and what place do these communities that have been so essential to my own formation have in the kind of work that I'm doing, right? So beginning with ourselves, I think, is a really important step. And then creating space at the table, creating space for this plurality of perspectives. I think the pluralism of this is also important.
Yeah, Tony, did you want to say anything to that about like how, like, what do you see working with how? Because since you've worked in public policy as well, what do you see? Like, what works, what doesn't work?
Well, I just repeat that, Christian democracy worked in Europe. Now, I understand that the United States doesn't have that Christian democratic tradition, but it did have something that was a little similar, and that was called the New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt was introduced to Catholic social teaching by a priest called Monsignor John A. Ryan, who's an expert on the just wage and Catholic social teaching. So Roosevelt, obviously not Catholic, but actually was well aware of this tradition, and it did influence him. So I think, the American tradition does have some common good tradition. As Elizabeth said, since 1980, with Reagan and everything that went with that, we've moved away from an idea of an economy based on the common good towards something much more individualistic and self-absorbed. But the tradition is there. We can reclaim our own tradition. It's in the American heritage. It's there, not too long ago. So we just need to go back to our roots.
Yeah. One other thing I'd add is that we haven't really spoken about. I feel like we've kind of been contrasting like the state versus, I don't know, free market capitalism or something. But there are many examples of what are sometimes referred to as third sector approaches, or just like robust civil society rooted approaches that focus on, again, enacting these important reflections on like important structural critiques of the economy, and also looking at these questions of ownership and plurality of ownership. And a good example of this is something that Elias Grimm here in the yellow shirt knows a lot about, called social cooperatives. So in the Emilia-Romagna region of Italy, there are non-governmental entities that, cooperatives essentially, that really focus on enacting this principle of the dignity of work by providing access to work opportunities for who would otherwise be more vulnerable members of the community, whether those are people with disabilities or, think about in this country, think how hard of a time we have figuring out our care infrastructure problem. Like, care is ridiculously expensive in the United States. I have paid an insane amount of money for childcare. And we often get caught in this sort of binary of like, okay, is it state-provided childcare, right? And the state is it provided through the private sector? Who pays for it? Well, I do think Catholic social teaching invites a much more nuanced reflection on who could be providing these types of services for the common good. It can be, like in the Emilia-Romagna region of Italy, you can have cooperatives that pay dividends into a common fund that is also met by the state to provide income smoothing for them over periods of economic downturn. So just, I think to me, again, it's this question of imagination. What might we imagine when we start with these principles of, hey, we want to provide dignified work. How are we going to do that? Like, if that is our guiding principle, let's cast a wider imagination for how we could be delivering that through entities that are not maybe so stuck in this binary kind of public-private dilemma that we struggle with here.
Yeah, I love that thinking outside of the box in terms of like getting away from the state, non-state dichotomy. We are going to go to questions soon, but first I also wanted to ask a little bit about, so Pope Francis did leave us in a certain place with Catholic social teaching. I would like to hear a little bit from probably Tony on where you left us, and then I think folks are really interested in hearing about Pope Leo too. And Elizabeth, if you want to chime in on that, I'd love to hear you too. But where do you see Pope Leo taking us in terms of the economy and how to view it and what's possible?
Yeah, well, starting with Pope Francis, he really centered Catholic social teaching and the rights and dignity of the poor and the environment. The phrase he used was, we need to hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. because in a sense it's the same pride. So he was very passionate about these kinds of issues. I think Pope Leo is a very different personality to Pope Francis. He's much more reserved, he's much more soft-spoken, but on the substance, I don't see much difference. He's following in the tradition of Pope Francis on all of these issues. He has spoken out against war, against environmental destruction, against neglect of the poor. One issue that he's really interested in, by the way, is artificial intelligence. And he said this when he was elected, this was going to be a priority of him. Because this is obviously, we have tech oligarchs who are just doing their own thing, and they are paying very little attention to the morality of what they're doing. So hopefully Pope Leo, he hasn't written any document on it yet, but I think that's going to be coming pretty soon.
Pope Francis was a person of grand gestures, and I think that was so necessary to kind of shake up the church, right? So washing the feet of prisoners, shedding the fancy garb, not living in the expensive papal apartment. These were gestures that brought us back to the essentials in many ways. And he was enacting the Franciscan tradition, which, by the way, has a lot to say about economics and economic structures. In the 15th century, St. Francis's community started what were called benevolent lending institutions. These are probably the original CDFIs. But basically they said, okay, it's not enough for us to be charitably giving. We need to disrupt the cycles of usury in our lending system here. So they created new types of lending institutions. So this goes back really far. But I think with Pope Leo, what feels really encouraging, and Tony's right on the emphasis on artificial intelligence, but I think Pope Leo is asking this really essential question of what does it mean to be human? And I know a lot of us are asking this question and we're approaching it from a lot of different angles, but for anyone who's interested, I would encourage you to look into Catholic social thought or come talk to us about some of the rich texts that you could dig into on that particular question. Because I think this is, I don't know where you all are at on this, but I think this is something that is stirring in many of us, okay? How do we get to a much more robust understanding and discourse of what does it mean to be human? What do we want to preserve in this human experience and human identity moving forward? And I think that's what I see Pope Leo leading into.
Thank you both. I think we're going to move into questions now, but I wanted to say before we cut the feed for those watching, our next event, we are having a conversation about tariffs. The title is Tariffs, Are They That Bad? It's going to be on the anniversary of Liberation Day, April 2nd, at Busboys and Poets on 450K. We have two of the best experts on tariffs in DC joining us, and we're going to talk about why economists got it wrong on the effects that we thought that tariffs were going to have, and we're going to have a bigger conversation about trade that is pro-worker and pro-community. So I'm really excited for that conversation. So for those joining us, thanks. For those online joining us, thanks. We're going to switch to a more candid Q&A conversation.